Welcome back to the 9th Macau Literary Festival. So now this is our 7th talk, starting from 4:45 p.m. We are very honored to invite Professor Zhu Shou Tong for a talk with the title Mao Dun, Leading the Trend of the Times in Anti-Trend. So Stacy will be our host today. So now we have the simultaneous interpreting service, so please enjoy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stacy, a journalist from Painel. In the last year, Zhu Shou Tong was also invited to have a talk with two new writers in Macau. So we did talk and discuss a lot about Lu Xun, a leading figure of the May 4th movement in China. So today we will focus on another leading figure, Mao Dun, who's also a leading figure in the May 4th movement in the early 20th century. So this year, it also marks the 100th anniversary of the short story magazine, which was founded by Mao Dun. So let me introduce you the Professor Zhu Shou Tong. He worked as a professor at University of Macau in 2007. Since 2007, and he's now a director of the Research Center for Humanities in South China, association director of the Center for Chinese History and Culture as well. So today, Professor Zhu will talk about Mao Dun. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here to talk about this great man, this great writer, Mao Dun, and also his achievement in literature, including his short story magazine. So first of all, the title I'm going to give today is Leading the Trend of the Times in Anti-Trend. I think among all these great Chinese literaries, no one can shoulder such a compliment. That is SHEN YANBING, which is actually the original name of Mao Dun. That's Mao Dun. So Mao Dun hasn't used his name Mao Dun before 1927. He used his original name SHEN YANBING. So after that, when he first introduced his first fiction, in 1928, Eclipse, and also one of his greatest works, Delusions, that only by then he used the name Mao Dun. So now we can look at the PowerPoint, the slide. This is the short story magazine, which is a very influential journal back then in early 20th century. Back then, a piece of newspaper or a piece of leaflet, it could actually lead a trend. It could be a trendsetter. Back then, in China, since 19th century, at the end of 1970s, 1870s. Back then, there was this newspaper was launched in Shanghai. It has launched for over 60 years in the late 19th centuries and early 20th century. That was a cradle for all this literature and all these writers, including Lu Xun. Lu Xun published his articles on Shenbao, this newspaper in Shanghai, and caught wide attention. Back then, Lu Xun published his famous collections called Right for Freedom, which was also published there. So when we talk about that freedom, the Shenbao, that newspaper, also has a very specific column called freedom. So my point is that a magazine or a newspaper can somehow can determine the entire zeitgeist and the development of literature of a certain era. So Xiaoshuo Yuebao, the short story magazine, it's one of a kind of that trendsetting journals that I'm talking about. So today, it marks the 100th anniversary of this short story magazine first published. But 1921, it was actually when this short story magazine reformed a new format. And that was actually led by YANBING, aka Mao Dun. So this is a new version. In 1921, 100 years ago. What was this original face? In its former form, it's different. So we can see now this is Mao Dun. A photo taken in Shanghai when he first worked at the commercial press in Shanghai. He was an apprentice in this printing house, the commercial press, and then later he became an editor who was responsible in reforming this magazine. So it was taken in Tongxiang, near a city near Shanghai. He was not very good looking, to be honest. Guo and other famous writer, he said, when I first met Mao Dun looks like a mouse. That's what Guo said. Guo was belittling Mao Dun, saying he's not good looking. Yet Mao Dun was a very talented man. So the short story magazine, as we can see in the slide. So this magazine was burned in a major event in 1923. It was all burned, including that commercial press factory. All of the copies of these magazines and even all the related documents were burned down right after that January 28th incident. That was actually a historical time when the Japanese were bombing China in early 20th century. And by that, after that January 28th incident, it was suspended and stopped publishing. So at the very beginning of this short story magazine, in the first 10 years of 20th century, we can call it a newspaper or a journal, belongs to the Mandarin Duck and Butterfly School, which means a school that focuses a lot on popular culture, popular literature. popular stories and novels, meaning readers loved reading these genres. It's like stories and novels and on the street, off the street. There are several characters. There are several categories. Some of them it's called like romantic novels and stories. That's why people call it quote Mandarin Duck and Butterfly School. Like things talking about things that it's about love and romance, just like the Mandarin ducks, one male and one female. They have a very strong intimacy and flirting around and dating. So that is the popular literature we were talking about back then in the early 20th century. There is nothing heavy like things that Lucian wrote back then. Instead, it was very light. It was very light about love affairs. People think it's like stories to kill time.
And there are some topics on Chinese wuxia stories and about Chinese martial arts. These are some of the topics that we have. And there are also detective stories and stories about the stories in the secrets in the palace of different dynasties in China. So these are some of the topics that writers tend to write. They write about the anecdotes, the secrets. And at that time, it's like a kind of trend for writers to write on that. So apart from the short story magazine, we also have this publication, 礼拜六, Saturday. So this is one of the magazine that they published in terms of popular culture. So literature is for leisure, so for entertainment. So it provides this kind of function for people, and it becomes more receptive, and people are willing to buy them. So there is another piece of work, 玉离魂, for example. So this trend in literature shares something with us, and we can connect with it. So, for example, in Zhuhai, which is very close to us, there's a very significant person named Su Manshu, and he's very talented. And what he wrote belonged to the Mandarin Duck and Butterfly School literature. And he's very well learned, and he read a lot of the Chinese literature, such as the Mansion of the Red Chamber, A Dream of the Red Chamber, and he wrote the memories of a drifting life. It's shown on the PPT right now. Su Manshu is very debatable whether his writing belongs to Mandarin Duck and Butterfly School or not. Well, I don't think it's a problem, because this school of writing is not something that writers have to be faithful about. So I think it doesn't matter. And for the works that he produced and the books that he wrote, were very popular at that time. And that's an example of literature for leisure. And this happened during the early years of the Republic of China. And there's a kind of a trend in the literary atmosphere at that time. People published newspapers, magazines, and new forms of media. And this phenomenon became very popular at that time. And it's also like a startup for the cultural market. And people were following this trend. And Shen Yanbing is a representative of the news. And he's trying to anti this fashion or this trend. So he published the short story magazine as a kind of reformation. And he worked on the short story magazine. He tried to anti the idea of using literature as a kind of leisure or entertainment. So when the manifestation is being published in the short story magazine, he wrote that when literature, the period for literature as a kind of leisure is over. So now it's the era for popular literature. It's the era for our publication, for example, the short story magazine, Saturday. So it's not about leisure or entertainment. They think that literature has its responsibility. It is a job. So for us, we understand that, for example, in China, in Xinhui, there is a very renowned writer, Liang Qichao. He also wrote about an article talking about literature and the people. So he talked about the novels of a country needs a kind of reformation and also change the way people think. So the revision of the short story magazine, Shen Yanbing has done a lot in this, and is like corresponding to what Liang Qichao has said. And so for the new literature in China, these revolutionary writers are closely connected to the development and the changes that took place. So for this short story magazine, it's like a job, a very serious type of job. So it's far away from leisure, from entertainment. Shen Yanbing publishes articles, publishes literary articles, research, translation of Russian writers. And he also published some translations of Russian writers. And later on, we have Chinese writers like Hu Shi, who appreciated the realism of Norway writer Ibsen. And we can also find the translation of Ibsen's work on short story magazine by Lu Xun. And so the short story magazine is not only a magazine, it's something more literary. It covers poetry, essays, plays, a novel, and a history of literature. And Shen Yanbing works a lot on editing the magazine, and he's got some theoretical works published. One of it is called the Hui Tu Ben. So it's about the history of Chinese literature. And in this way, we can think about the commercial press at that time, the publishing house at that time, for those romantic novels, the wuxia novels. When people were reading these magazines or novels, they were selling really well at that time. But now, things have changed. The direction has changed. So for literature translation or theories, we know that they don't sell really well. And so for the printing house, they think that literature is something very important and it's very meaningful. So they support this kind of publication. And so the concept of the short story magazine is what I think that Shen Yanbing is trying to anti the trend and to create a new trend in literature. And so for new literature writers such as Bingxing, they all came a long way. They were nurtured from this magazine, short story magazine, and they developed into new literature writers. And new literature is also a new trend. So new literature is like derived from this magazine. That's what I'm talking about, how a new trend's being created. I think this phenomenon is not very common in terms of Chinese literature, because you are trying to create something new and not supporting the original trend. And during the May 4th Reformation, there is a new trend of writing romance novel or romance literature. We are encouraging the young people to join and participate in the new literature. So including Lu Xun, another Chinese writer, he also wrote articles related to love stories, romance. This is because these topics were very popular among young people. So from the new, from the youth, to magazine to another new magazine, they were about love, about romance. So the romantic novels and this new trend has created another new trend. So Shen Yanbing, when he's editing the magazine, he wanted to not to emphasize too much on love, but more on the true feelings on the people, on the grassroots, on what's really happening to the people at that time.
Mao Dun or Shen Yanbing emphasized on the blood and tears because he argued that we should care more about these grassroots families and class, grassroots class in the society. So Mao Dun was actually anti-trend within his own camp. The papers and the articles that he received back then, he said, 85% to 90% are all about love stories. He said, how can it be? So he was trying so hard to find things among all these submissions. He was searching for those that doesn't wrote love stories but only wrote about the blood and tears and feelings. So eventually he found this essay wrote by Li Ming called The Self-Monologue of a Labor in 3 Days. And also another writer called Li Miaoshi who wrote an article about the working class. And also another article that was about a disabled person. So these 3 articles were chosen by Mao Dun. Now, okay, after 1930s, we can call Shen Yanbing Mao Dun now. So Mao Dun actually created his best works because he didn't write love stories. Instead, he wrote about the blood and tears of working class, including me, for example. Even me and my students, when we were listening to professors, they asked us to, we should read those things. So all these articles, these works, they are actually hard to read. They are actually difficult to read. They are not that quality works, in fact. So only when these articles were actually lectured by me, because when I was talking about the Chinese literature history, then why Mao Dun used these? Why Mao Dun actually recommend these stories, these writings? Because he was actually anti-trend. Even these are not quality work, yet the spirit and the themes are something we need to learn. They all talked about the working class, the blood and tears, instead of boring love stories. So don't forget, Shen Yanbing, namely Mao Dun, was also part of the Chinese Communist Party. Later he quit. Till when 1980s, he requested to the party to renew and then restore his membership in the Communist Party. Yet at the CCPPC, the National Committee of the Chinese People's Republic Consultative Conference, he became a part of it. He became a vice chairman of that. So there's another translator, Shen Zeming, along with Mao Dun. They are both party members. So what this translator translated? He translated Oscar Wilde's work. He was also a very revolutionary guy. He respected a lot Oscar Wilde because he could see the rebelliousness, the rebellion spirit in Oscar Wilde's works. So in the early days of the Communist Party, Mao Dun emphasized to write less love stories, but write more about the working class. So, of course, in later years, there are fewer people writing about love stories and love. So this trend was actually set by Mao Dun because he was going against the grain back then and started a new trend of the working class literature. So in 1927 to 1928, China was experiencing a inner war between the north and the south. The south is Guangdong, or the north of Guangdong. There were battles and war within the country. However, at this period, Mao Dun left Communist Party by then, and he realized he was very skeptical about this revolution, about this war, because he was doubtful about this class conflict happening in China. Back by then, he wrote several important novels. The first one is Disillusioned. The other one, it's called Pursuits, as well as Wavering. So Mao Dun, at this stage of his life, he was reflecting about this whole trend of revolution. He was sort of reigning on the parade of the communist parties back then. He later left Communist Party. He left China and he went to Japan for a short while. But now, when we think about it, during that period, in order to be anti-trend, to anti-revolution, it was kind of naive. That revolution was, in fact, a naive move. So Mao Dun was actually making a cautious and conscious move. So from this perspective, Mao Dun was very great to take such a stance and posture. And that is also why he named himself Mao Dun. In Chinese it means contradiction. Because on one hand, he wished there will be a revolution happening in China. On the other hand, he still didn't want such a revolution to be such a blind move, such a naive move. He wished a revolution that's better organized and well thought. That's why he named himself Mao Dun, meaning contradiction in Chinese. So, Yi Sheng Tao, another novelist, in 1927, in 1929, he became the editor of a short story magazine. He saw Mao Dun was calling himself Mao Dun, and he said, Mao Dun, it means contradiction, but let me change these characters a bit and still keep the sounds, but thus we have Mao Dun as a Chinese name for this writer. And also, for Mao Dun in 1934, a very important work called Midnight that was published by Mao Dun. This is an anti-trend novel Because at this point of history, everyone's writing about this rebellious, about the labor, about the working class people. Yet, for Midnight, such a novel, it talked about capitalists. It talked about a businessman. In this novel, it used a complementary, kind of like a honoring attitude to talk about capitalists and those businessmen. It's actually another rebellious move against the zeitgeist in the 30s. Yet now, when we look at this, maybe that it's a very major contributions that Mao Dun did to the Chinese literature. Yeah. And later, the capitalists in China, they learn more about life after reading this back then. So in this book, we see this book was about capitalism, and we need to, when we talk about the history of capitalism, the opening up policy of recent China, maybe all of that capitalist trend could be traced back to the 1930s when Mao Dun was writing that. So now, when we talk about Great Bay Area, we need to rethink and to reconstruct what is capitalism. The so-called comprador capitalism. We can't treat capitalism as our enemy. That's what I feel after coming back to coming to Macau. That's my observation. That we need to rethink capitalism in a way. Thank you. So, Professor Zhu, he actually has a lot of thoughts and very great opinions about Mao Dun and as well as the trend that Mao Dun led. So my question for you about Mao Dun, because Mao Dun was actually fighting against the trends. He was fighting against love stories. He was fighting against that revolution happening in China back then. He has a very non-mainstream point of view. It seems like everyone's drunk, but he's awake. How could he manage to do it? How could he remain sober within amongst all these drunken people in this metaphor?
Well, I think he's been taking risks in doing this anti-trend. However, some people can really do it well. For writers, they don't have to be, they are not bound by strict theories or manifestations. And they can express themselves with an attitude that's known by people through his work. And they are expressing their way of thoughts through their work, through the characters in their works, the relationship between the characters in the novels, to express what the writers are thinking. So I think it's kind of a soft anti-trend. So I think he can try to avoid conflict. And he's doing it in a more soft and beautiful way. And that's why he's able to do it well. And so when you truly understand his works, you can really feel what he's trying to express. For example, Lawrence who's a local writer, I think he can relate to that feeling. And when we are talking about this era, this century, when we are doing it through literature, novels, plays, poetry, for example, we can always try to avoid a very positive conflict. And we try to express our own understanding in our own way and create another trend and make it successful. So literature has this power. For Shen Yanbing, he's not very good at writing at the beginning. When he started writing novel, it's when he changed his name to Mao Dun. Before that, as Shen Yanbing, he didn't know how to write a novel. Why he became a novelist? And he also wrote plays. I think it's because he's got a conflict with the society. And that's where he found where he should stand in the society. So I think literature has this power. Well, Shen Yanbing has also plays the role of how to change the society through this soft power, which is literature. So for Mao Dun, Mao Dun has actually lived in Macau in the 1930s to 40s. And he thought that Macau lacked culture at that time. But I think this is a very subjective idea about Macau. And at that time, Macau's got a culture like the traditional Chinese one. And, well, if he's coming to Macau right now, what do you think he's going to comment on Macau's culture? Well, for Mao Dun, he thinks that culture is about writing the grassroots, the labor, the workers, instead of romance or love stories. And so the new literature is what he favors. So for traditional literature or other kinds of literature, he's not very into it or not very familiar about it. So at that time, he made that comment about Macau. And for Macau at that time, new literature played its function before 1936. There is a new bookstore established at that time, and that's when new literature was introduced. And my colleague, in 1921, when the magazine was revised, the new poetry already appeared in Macau, and it's been mixed with the traditional poetry. And so for new culture movement, it happens at a time when Mao Dun arrived in Macau in the 30s and 40s. Well, nowadays, I think he won't make the same comment. Everyone is busy with their own work. And for people in Macau, we are still holding a Macau literary festival during the pandemic. And we've got a lot of achievement for this festival. So it shows that the culture in Macau still exists. People are passionate about it. And we are not affected by the pandemic. And this is how our society should be. Even though we are also working on the economy, but we never forget about literature. We have culture. we have a very rich culture in Macau. Well, I think if Mao Dun is able to come today and experience Macau, he will have a different opinion. And for this magazine, it's been 100 years, and the language has changed, and the trend in literature has changed as well over the 100 years. What have you observed in terms of literature nowadays? And can you name some writers who have this anti-trend? Oh, well, let's talk about different regions. For example, in the US, Australia, in Europe, in Asia. So for Chinese literature, it's all spread out. And it's not easy to become a trend in itself. So if we say in the 1960s to 80s, Chinese literature was a trend because there is a core power. We have very solid foundation from China and Taiwan in terms of literature, and they were influential writers, and they created different trends. For example, literature about their home country, rural literature, and modern literature. But right now, we don't have that much variety. Even though we have many diversities in our daily lives, and we have different writers in Chinese writers in different parts of the world, and they all have their nostalgia for their own home or country. They might not be expressing them, and they already have their own life, their own work, or their literature circle or community in their own city. And so there are many different literature groups or communities in different parts of the world. They establish their own publications, they launch their own websites. So they are all doing their own things. And so I think it's not easy to establish a new trend. And now the situation in Taiwan is unstable. So all these are not making the trend happen. But I've noticed that Chinese literature has been paying attention to the Chinese culture, the Chinese traditional culture. For example, from different writers, they have also incorporated this traditional Chinese culture into their works. And one of them used the topic of archaeology and the resources and put into his work. And that's why these are some of the resources that writers are using in their work. But I don't think this is like a trend.
Yeah, as you have mentioned, we won't be able to see one single trend, but we see a very prosperous different trends happening in the world. Any questions from the floor? We can now open the floor, and if you have anything to respond, then please feel free. So here we see like there's so many people who are non-Chinese speakers in the audience. So if you have to recommend one book to the non-Chinese speaking audience, which one you would recommend? Which books by Mao Dun? If I have to make a recommendation, first one I would recommend the book called The Shop of the Lin Family. This is not a long novel. It's a medium size length fiction. But The Shop of the Lin Family, this book, it's about Lin family. They are basically runs a grocery. It talks about the life of this Lin grocer. It's very hard to maintain a living, maintain the shop, the business. It's a very Chinese life. We can say he depicted this atmosphere and business of such a Chinese life in a rural area. It's very different than the shops in Macau. Because, for example, if Macau's shops in Macau, they don't worried about incomes in a way because there are lots of tourists. Yet, in the story, the shop of the Lin family, Lin, the owner, has to juggle between the relationships between everyone in that village, in the rural area. He was using this small business method and model to make a living within such a rural background and setting. This is a very amazing book, and lots of foreign writers and other Chinese writers, they are not capable of writing something like that. So I recommend this book, The Shop of the Lin Family. So I believe there will be translations. There are English and French translations available, I believe, of this novel, The Shop of the Lin Family. I'm not sure whether there will be Portuguese translation yet, but maybe it's coming in the future. So another question for you. Mao Dun is not only a literary critic and also theorist, but also he was once a president of the PRC Writers Union. He's also, there's a very influential literary awards named after him. As I mentioned, Mao Dun was one of the key persons within the Chinese Communist Party. In that time, we can't say it's all people they were connected. There are lots of family, friends, and family relatives. They actually all were in the Communist Party back then. For example, Xu Xiubai or Chen Duxiu or Xu Xiubai's uncle. Usually, writers and their family members, they were all in the Communist parties. Why was like that? Because Communist Party was underground, was an underground model running before 1949. Everything was secret, otherwise that's easier for them to function and to organize. We can't say it's nepotism, but later, Communist Party came into power, then the family connections were less prominent after that. But talking about Mao Dun, after he left Communist Party, we can call Mao Dun as a Bolshevik outside the party. Mao Dun was actually helping the party at the most difficult times of the party in later years. Mao Dun was taking lots of risk went to the northwest parts and went to Yan'an to help and visit and to care the Communist Party. And later he wrote things and to praise the party. That was not easy because in the early years of the Communist Party came into power, it's not easy for him to show his stance and who still cared a lot about the party and its development. So later, Mao Dun was one of the most important writers after Guomo Ruo, who were actually participated in the Communist Party. So Mao Dun has always been playing an important role in the Chinese culture ministry of culture. So for those who cannot adapt into to the new era, Mao Dun was actually helping them to take care of these old writers. So a few years ago, when it was the 100th anniversary of Cao Yu, another influential writer, so people said Zhou Yang and other writer, he was actually very helpful to the people because Zhou Yang was very terrifying. But when people look at Mao Dun, when people saw Mao Dun, people feel comfortable because Mao Dun was always taking care of others, was always having people's back. Mao Dun had a very close connection and relationship with Communist Party, as if they are born of the same blood. And Mao Dun was actually fighting a lot rights and welfare for intellectuals and writers. He was maintaining this close relationship with the Communist Party as well as other intellectuals and writers. So, do you have any questions or opinions? If no, then thank you again, Professor Zhu, for your amazing talk. Thank you.